Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack from our new apartment as well, and we're still getting things set up, but I wanted to make a video talking about one of these tweets by Ellesemere recently where he said, I've never seen M plus push keys gated by insanely frequent one-shot mechanics like this season in my life. A Room King got one shot 5 seconds into a boss fight by a mechanic that goes out every 7 seconds, which is the Throne of the Tides Flame Shock boss. It's like the shaman, or it's like the squid on his head. We didn't even bother rezzing, just 4-man the entire boss, and then still chested it with 2 minutes left. This goes into a lot of talk from him about output versus survivability, and naturally, as dungeons are constantly scaling in both health and damage of the monsters, having them in sync is really important. Although we talked about this a bit in our season 3 is going to be hard video, which turned out to not be the case because they didn't actually buff mob health very much, which was my assumption. And as a result of them not doing it, you start seeing dungeons on 24s, 25s, 26s get chested very rapidly, and LFG getting filled up with pug groups that are doing this, when in previous seasons, particularly in the past, even in Shadowlands or even further behind, there were a lot of times where people were not just, going for 24, 25, 26 pugs, where it was much harder to have them this early into the season, where we're still, 2 months in or something along those lines, and people are just starting to get into that higher 480 level, especially from raiding. So, biggest thing that happens is one of the first comments that I saw was, hey, remember Legion? Or, hey, remember, this is infinitely scaling content? Yeah, duh, we get it. It's actually different this time. Back in Legion, there was absolutely large amounts of one-shots that were going out, but there was also gear swapping. And so, naturally, you had a sort of counter mechanic to deal with it when you could swap gear into high avoidance sets, high survivability sets, and while you were locked in with your talents, you could also just be running specific talents that are allowing you to set yourself up just for one boss fight, and further improving it by the gear options that you had, which were very many. You had the Ishkar's Fell Shield emitter back in the day, which is very similar to the Leaf of the Ancient Protectors that we have now. And since it dropped off an early boss fight, you could think of it as the equivalent of dropping off of the Council fight, or maybe even a Volcaros or Laradar in the current raid. It was a very early boss fight called the Antoran High Command. It was very easily farmable very early on. And as a result, you were having full groups being able to run with this setup. There was also really high-end websites that people were using to be able to calculate their health, because there also wasn't any damage variance between how much enemy damage was dealt to your player. And so you could look at your health, take into account your versatility, your stamina, your avoidance, and then be able to calculate it. I know even maybe from Liquid was also talking about some of the mechanics in dungeons having a bit of spell variance. It's a little bit harder to be able to make those calculations in advance when you don't exactly know exactly how much damage you're going to be taking. Although for a lot of the mechanics and a lot of the ones that Ellesemere listed, you do. That being said, what's different about this season is that it is, one, much harder when it comes to survivability versus healing checks, where some moments the healer is having so much stress given to them to be able to meet those healing checks, and other areas like Ellesemere mentioned on the Throne of the Tides boss with the flame shocks, it's just this instant burst of damage that you have really no room to be able to respond to. One of the most frequent things I hear this week is about the Time Waste boss in Galakrond's Fall for Dawn of the Infinites, where there's just this burst of explosion that goes out, burst of damage that goes out, that you need to be able to top off before the next wave comes. And it is extremely difficult to make sure that you're tracking people's location, getting the dispel off, especially when you're in a no voice pug group, and making sure everyone's kind of doing their jobs as they're supposed to. And it causes tons and tons of wipes as a result. Because of this, you're having the large issue of being able to deal with survivability in a comp, but Fall is one of the easiest dungeons for timers, and so as a result, you can get into boss fights at 24, 26 key levels and have multiple deaths, a very large amount of deaths, and still be able to chest the dungeons because the throughput requirements, the damage requirements, are so insanely low. And so this is different than a lot of other seasons, where usually it would be min-maxing your damage until you eventually got to a point where, yeah, you could still do the damage, but you'd have to pull so many monsters that if one errant cast got through, you just died, and then the whole pool just falls apart, and then it's chaos, right? That is kind of the difference. That's what we saw out of dungeons like in Necrotic Wake in Shadowlands, where being able to use the weapons gave you so much output that you were just trying to survive the entire dungeon because you were able to get so much damage to kill all the monsters that it was just a dungeon built off survivability more so than overall throughput. There was, of course, some disadvantages with that. If you didn't have enough weapons to break through shields on the final boss, there are other examples, sure. But that dungeon specifically and how it worked has kind of spread all over into this season, which has caused a number of really weird things in that the best specs, like Ellesemere mentioned, are those that are just going to be able to survive. On the healer side, survivability obviously is super important, but there are still really challenging output checks. And unlike in Legion, two factors are very important. You don't have the gear swaps on hand. Healing is going to be harder. And honestly, kind of a third one, I would say, is that Legion really built up a culture around we just have to survive. And I remember progressing in Legion M Plus dungeons, and everybody would kind of pull up the same website from, I believe it was Nagi or Trance, or maybe both of them, where you would go and make the calculations as to how you'd be able to survive. And it was a culture built off survivability. For a lot of Dragonflight, we try to build up this culture about like mob shutdown and also healers heal again, which didn't really, well, the second part didn't exist too much in Shadowlands outside of maybe like Sanguine Depths, where healers had a much easier time in Shadowlands. And then there was the sort of like fourth DPS that they existed as in Shadowlands, and then they get flung right back into really difficult healing content. And when I look back at some of my videos from Legion times, yeah, the healing checks are like pretty difficult, but only at like the highest key levels, and you didn't have this sort of brick wall that exists right now in Season 3 of Dragonflight, where there's either insane heal checks or insane survivability checks. And sometimes they get a little bit mixed together on certain encounters, but a lot of times it's, okay, this boss, we just need to be able to have cooldowns to survive. Okay, this boss, we need the healer to heal, and everybody use defensives well. Otherwise, you just get pounded like crazy. And because a lot of the timers are so forgiving, because the throughput requirement, the damage requirement in dungeons is so low, then you're getting into areas where pugs are able to smash face and kind of just roll the dice in dungeons until they just build up lots of IO score. And I'd say in a lot of cases, as you get towards the end of the season, getting a lot of IO can often be a lot about time investment. And sometimes it's for dedicated teams trying to roll the right keys, but also for those who just kind of pug a lot. They're just getting a certain chance of success, and they're just taking more dice rolls than other people and just continuing to pug, which is really where you started seeing like Augevokers, especially last season, who had no idea about dungeon mechanics, but getting up to like 3100, 3300 IO and beyond, because they were just going to be the passenger princess spec of that patch. Now you're still having that, but it exists with other DPS specs where there's a lot of times where people are just smashing face, not really getting punished for mistakes because of more forgiving timers. There's not so much pressure on who's doing the most damage in a lot of compositions in the pug scene, because, hey, if you just chested the dungeon, no one's really going to be worrying or stressing about how much damage you're dealing. But there's a lot of moments where you're having deaths that are happening, and maybe the healer's able to do something, especially if they have large defensive trinkets like Leaf of the Ancient Protector to preemptively account for somebody not having a defensive or account for them not using their defensive. But then there's other moments where one wrong step, even at the pug level of M+, where people are naturally trying to make sure they're progressing up in keys without a dedicated team, without dedicated communications, and then there's just sort of one-shots galore. And so you start rising into this level very quickly for M+ers, where you start running into the brick wall of needing high-end coordination, really good defensive usage, more so than you need good damage dealers. And so you're just having moments where it's a very different season than we've ever experienced for M+. And in a lot of cases, we saw this in PTR. We saw early on in PTR that groups were able to run just crazy high dungeons, and even in some cases they're running without affixes, which always happens, but the mob health was so low because the M0 baseline scaling that they have before, you know, the 1000% extra damage and the 1000% extra healing or health comes up for the affix, right? Before any of that happens, before the keystone level increases mob damage, mob health, there's the base Mythic 0 level. And they didn't really do a lot of buffs to the health of the mobs. Then we're getting into crazy levels of damage to survive, and that's the area that we live in. Unfortunately, I think Blizzard really shot themselves in the foot with their PTR testing in this cycle, and there's not really like an easy solution to be able to do it, except just do it right the first time. Honestly, kind of like what healing is in Dragonflight as well, and why it's been so stressful. They missed their boat to be able to fix it the first time, and they try to make a number of band-aid fixes. It's been okay, it's been better for sure in Season 3, but it's far from the heydays that we've experienced in previous expansions for healers. Now for M+, we're having this situation where they kind of can't really do anything. You're not really able to just vastly increase monster HP to be able to bring things back into balance. I guess you could just do blanket damage nerfs or something like that for dungeons, which would again kind of trigger this spike in IO score like we just saw out of Aug of Ochre getting brought to the table, and then them changing the dungeon scaling from 10% per key level to 8% past 20s that they did in Season 2. I guess they could do that if they really wanted to, but I really don't expect them to make those big changes, and I think a lot of it is self-inflicted, that they were not having M+ testing on PTR with real eye level. We were like 440, by the way, by not actually making changes to the baseline scaling while we were PTR testing. And then they also shot themselves in the foot by not forcing PTR testers to run full affix keys and allowing them to use scrolls to build their own keys. Kind of just always results in them running no affix setups, just no matter what. And so you always have this tainted data, this less efficient data to be able to make your decisions with, which then impacts player experience 2-3 months down the line, and you are now here. Going forward, I hope I'm going to make some changes for Fated, because I think there's a lot of opportunities that Blizzard has from using player testers to get good feedback, because you're naturally going to get the sweats like me and others doing PTR testing like crazy and doing it for our own selves to learn about dungeons. And if you forced people to run affix combos, and if you forced different item levels for the players and different scaling on a week-by-week basis, or maybe every bi-weekly basis, people would still run those dungeons and you'd still actually get good data. And then everybody's experience, including Jimmy Casual, is going to be much better as a result. Balls in your court, Blizzard. Hopefully they're going to make some changes, and hopefully you guys have already subscribed to the YouTube channel, because if you haven't, here's your perfect opportunity. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.